And I'm a sophomore biology major from Baltimore, Maryland. The title of my project is called The Ins and Outs of Maya. I chose this title because before coming to Spelman, I had never really used the term intersectionality. I often had assumed that what people could visibly see would determine the privilege that I had. But I also, to a certain extent, knew that certain aspects of my life allow me to be more privileged, such as my social class and even my religion, that aren't always visible right away, where I hadn't been discriminated against. However, I still had many parts of my identity where I was oppressed, such as my race, my gender, and even my age at times. Through psychology of women, I was able to see how these different varying parts of my identity have created forms of oppression and privilege that has changed even as I have moved to different cities and states throughout my life, and as I grow older as well. Before, I didn't see age or other forms as part of my identity that showed up in this way, but as I reflect on my life during this class, I'm able to see now how these various identities do lead to forms of oppression or privilege. So this first picture shows the intersection between gender, class, and sex. This picture shows my privilege of my age and my social class. I'm able to attend Spelman College and live in a relatively nice neighborhood, and my parents were able to afford my sister and I to go to college and go on trips at times and have birthday parties. But this also shows my identity and intersection and oppression of gender identity and sex. I remember when I went to pick up the balloons from Party City, I was asked, since I was a girl, shouldn't I get the pretty rose gold colors. I didn't really have an issue with it at the time, thinking, yeah, pink is for girls. But as I reflected on chapter 4 of the textbook from class, the authors mentioned the idea of gender socialization. And looking back at this photo, I realized how we often associate perceived sex automatically with gender, and thus the oppressions of gender socialization informing how a woman should think, should dress, what they should wear, and how they should act. This next photo shows the intersection between race and religion. As a Christian, I face privileges that other religions don't, and I've never felt uncomfortable telling people I'm a Christian. In many of the places I've lived in, Christianity has been the dominant religion, in which I didn't worry about being discriminated against, which some people do fear. In chapter 2, the authors talk about the dressing model and how certain social identities give people more power and privilege, such as being a Christian. However, this also shows my role as a black woman and how, even though I attended black church, I saw how we still face struggles as black people that other white Christians may not face, including racism and discrimination, both within the church setting and other areas of life that are made us oppressed. These next two photos show the intersection between my status as being able-bodied, my age, and my race. Even though I'm a bit younger in these photos, they still show my privilege as my age. This is a picture of my family on vacation and my sister and I playing in the snow. As I look back on the photos or when I go into public spaces, I realize how often some places are not accessible for people who are not able-bodied, such as people who are bound to wheelchairs or even older people who can't walk as easily. In chapter 6 of the textbook, the authors discuss how being able-bodied is often seen as the norm, and people with both visible and non-visible disabilities are not talked about or seen in the media, which can make it hard to recognize or think about. This is a form of privilege that my age and able-bodiedness that I don't think about on a daily basis. However, this picture also shows the oppression I face with my race. Especially when I lived in Wisconsin or whenever my family goes on vacation, I felt that people would stare at us or as if we didn't belong or even question my family being able to afford certain things or go to certain places just because we were black. This next photo, I'm in the very back, but it shows the intersection between race and gender. This was me at the NAACP AXO Competition Awards with my competition group, which is a program for African American youth to compete in various fields. In this scenario, I'm celebrated for my blackness, and all other youth there were celebrated, and the many talents that we possess and encompass as black people. In this way, our race was celebrated, not oppressed. But I still faced oppression because of my gender. The competition I competed in had all male judges, and there weren't many women contestants in my particular field. And even then, I felt like I had to work harder just because I was a woman to be seen in that competition. This reminded me of the textbook when Liz and co-authors mentioned how certain traits are associated with certain genders, such as the genetic traits with men. I felt like I had to be assertive and out there in order to be seen and valued. This last photo shows the intersection between race, class, and gender and sex. This photo shows a picture of me in advisory in middle school. Throughout secondary school, I went to predominantly white schools in both Ohio and Wisconsin, where I often was one of few black people. I was fortunate enough that my parents were able to work and I was able to go to these schools, showing my privilege with my social class. But I also faced oppression in these schools from peers and especially from parents who would often question me and my sister belonging in these schools, in these spaces, or my family being able to afford these schools, or even our educational abilities. This mainly came from parents, which shows the way that age plays a role in this, in the oppression I faced from my age, just because parents would question me or ask me questions about my parents' job or being able to afford the school. Furthermore, this picture shows the emphasis on gender identity and oppression that we faced as women in this school. In my middle school, we were split into advisories based on our perceived gender identity, and in these classes, we were taught things specific for our perceived gender identity, such as in the girls' advisory, when we wore skirts, we had to do the knee test and measure how long our skirts were, or else we would get a write-up, in which the boys did not face this at all. And it shows how people who do identify as women, we face oppressions that others don't. This was brought up in the textbook with the concept of gender schema and roles. But it also shows the emphasis and assumption that many schools and people make that sex automatically equals gender, and thus splitting children up by this binary division. So to conclude, I put this quote by Audre Lorde, which says, "There is no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives." I've realized there are so many parts of my identity that allow me to be privileged in some aspects that are not always visible, but I still face oppressions even in some environments where I thought I wouldn't. This project was important in understanding, to me, the way intersectionality plays a role in my life, both giving me privilege and oppression.